Okay, we've heard Penny Wong lay out the government's direct action plans, if you like, the rats and mice, as Jane Castle described them as. Let's have a listen to Tony Abbott on Four Corners on Monday night.
We have agreed to get a 5% emissions reduction target. That's a bipartisan position. I think we can get it by the direct action measures that I've outlined. And the interesting thing is that the only major political party with a credible policy in this area is the coalition. The government says that climate change is the greatest moral challenge of our time, but they don't have a serious policy to deal with it.
Well, the Coalition's $3.2 billion emissions reduction fund is going to be able to buy cuts, as John Connor's already pointed out, or offsets in carbon pollution, up to 400 million tonnes at Hazelwood Power Station alone, if the Coalition funded that station to close down or switch to cleaner energy. Is Tony Abbott right, Ken Henry? Can he deliver a 5% cut by 2020 on carbon emissions?
Fran, I wish I was the Secretary of Treasury. Don here.
What did I call you? Ken Henry.
I just thought that's a promotion. I'd work hard on a sustainable economy.
We talk about him so much these days, Don. Sorry, I beg your pardon.
Well, no worries, Fran. Fran, look, there are some elements of the Coalition's policy that will reduce emissions, tree planting, some direct buying of pollution. It's an expensive way to do it, and some elements, in our view, are not credible. For instance, at the moment, soil carbon is speculative, so we've got a question mark whether they can hit that 5%. And let's remember, as John said earlier, the actual commitment of both major parties is they'll reduce emissions somewhere between 5 and 25%, and Professor Garno estimates that the world work on this at the moment probably has Australia somewhere at minus 15% or more. So I don't think it's good enough just to debate whether one can hit a 5%. Australia should and will need to do more this decade, so the policies need to be able to do more work than they're currently pitched at doing.
Okay, it's 8:25 on RM Breakfast. We're fast running out of time on this panel. The whole notion of a carbon tax, John and Jane, let me bring you in here. Greg Hunt, the Coalition's climate change spokesperson, says the Coalition's be prepared to pay up to $25 a tonne for carbon abatement. Now, that's in a sense a carbon tax, isn't it?
Oh, this is where...
the taxpayer's paying for that.
This really gets me cranky because it's basically taxpayers buying carbon. Why is that not a carbon tax? I mean, that's what it certainly is, pure and simple.
Jane Castle, you're a keen watcher of the energy industry. What difference do you think a carbon price of $25 would make?
Look, it would certainly make a difference, but the problem is the Coalition wants to pick winners instead of letting the market decide. Now, if you put a price on carbon through an emissions trading scheme, you can let the industry itself choose which is going to be the best kind of generation for the future, instead of throwing money at experimental schemes like soil carbon and retiring one generator down here but letting another one go on. It just doesn't make sense, and it is inefficient and it's more costly.
We heard earlier a package we had played on the radio earlier talking to the energy sector, and their suggestion that because of the uncertainty in the policy, actually the price of electricity generation is going up anyway. How does that work?
Absolutely. There's a lot of panic really out there in the investment market because no one knows what's going to happen. So people are holding off from investing in anything, and that includes energy efficiency. It includes clean renewable generation and dirty generation. So the energy industry itself is starting to really worry because there's no movement in the financial markets. It's a real problem. The industry is begging for certainty, and it's not coming from either party.
It's not coming. There's no sign it's going to come. We're in an election campaign. There's been no promises to suggest anything different except quite the opposite. John Connor, Bob Brown says that if he holds the balance, or the Greens hold the balance of power in the Senate, they're going to be insisting on some kind of carbon tax, the first item on the list when he meets with the next Prime Minister.
Well, I think it's an important first step to let's get that price on it, but let's make sure we do have that within the context of an emissions trading scheme so we can get going there. It's that long-term decision-making that's crucial here, as Jane was saying. Power plants are around for 40-odd years, and so people who are going to invest in those, they know at some price, at some time, a price tag on pollution is coming. And so what they're doing, because there's so much uncertainty, they're building cheap to build but expensive to operate power plants.
Don Henry, we're not going to get an ETS this time, for sure, this next 3 years. unless people power has something to do with it to change their mind. Now, I can't see how that's going to work. We already have surveys showing 61% of Australians want action on climate change and they're not getting it. What do you think might happen in the next 3 years electorally or could happen?
Fran, look, I think people power and business power will be important. I think, unfortunately, we've just got the circumstances of an election campaign where it's such a small target, where we're seeing a lack of leadership and courage on this crucial issue. But, Fran, you're absolutely right. The polling is consistently saying the majority of Australians support action to put a price tag on pollution. The majority of Australians want renewables boosted. The majority of Australians want to see energy efficiency driven out there. It's very important in these last few days of the election campaign, but also after it, that Australians and businesses who want to see action raise up our voices and make sure we build the support and the pressure for action. I'm confident it will happen. I'm confident we can do that. But Australians will have to make sure their voices are louder.
Okay, and just very briefly, John Connor, do you think the rest of the world might take some action to force Australia to this point?
Look, absolutely. We're already seeing other countries looking at putting prices on Australian imports. That's happening in Japan. India are budgeting at that in their next cycle. There's plenty of action happening in China. We are at great risk to our exports if we don't get going with it because they'll slap a carbon tax on us.
And Jane Castle, a final word from you?
It's an embarrassment. China has a 20% energy efficiency target. Where is Australia? Energy bills are going up by 42% in the next 5 years because we're spending $40 billion on inefficient infrastructure. The parties both go on about rising costs of living, but why aren't they doing something to actually reduce electricity bills through energy efficiency?
Okay, Jane Castle, John Connor and Don Henry, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Jane Castle from the Total Environment Centre, John Connor from the Climate Institute and Don Henry from the ACF. It's 8:29 on RM Breakfast.